pass them down, and if you've got a question you'd like to see us ask, write it down on the card and pass it back to the center aisle. We'll be taking those up after we collect, after the second question. We'll review the questions and select one to pose to the candidates. And in just a moment, we'll go to Owen Crew to offer the invocation, and then to Barry Bell will lead us in the pledge.
Sorry, I'm a little bit late, everybody.
How many seconds was yellow card? Is that 10 or 30?
That's a great question. How many seconds is the yellow card? How many seconds is the yellow card? 30 seconds left. Thank you. You as well. Talking about making a dramatic entrance. Fashionably.
It wasn't on purpose.
Oh, traffic.
Let's pray. Almighty God, creator and ruler of the world, you are the only God. You have given the nations to your Son as his inheritance, and the farthest part of the earth as his possession. We come to you today praying that you would give peace to this earthly city, the United States of America, so that in its peace, your church might have peace. We pray that you would give guidance and blessing to its rulers, and that they would know the peace that comes through faith in Jesus Christ. We pray that you would give them understanding and strength to follow your law that you have revealed in your holy scriptures and in the human heart. We pray at this time that you would be with us in this debate, that it would give insight to the voters of the 4th District, and we ask all these things with the confession of our sins and thanksgiving for your many mercies. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, amen. The candidates will now, I'm sorry. I have a piece first. Okay. So we wanted to thank you all for joining us for our first ever congressional debate. Consistent Conservatives of South Carolina began as a Facebook group, and we had the purpose of prioritizing conservative principles over political personalities. We are a nonpartisan group, and we promote conservative ideas and people. In the American political context, we stand for biblical religion, natural law, and constitutional government. Without compromising on principles, we seek to work with anyone to achieve our common goals. And now we will hear from the candidates. They will introduce themselves and speak to their foreign policy outlook and qualifications. Let's start at the end with Dan Albert and work our way this way.
Test. My name is Dan Albert, and I'm seeking election to the 4th Congressional District. I'm a small businessman that has I've spent 3 decades or more in business, and I've had some successes and some failures. And through the financial collapse that happened in 08, 07 and 08, basically, we bailed out the banks, and I and many other people in the construction products and construction-related businesses were squeezed out. And so I've written a book called The Albert Plan to Save America, and I believe our nation's in distress and that we need a bold, comprehensive, transformational plan for we the people to take our country back. As to foreign policy, I believe our nation should reassert itself, and we should seek peace through strength, which has been our tradition, and to speak softly and carry a big stick, which is the mantra that we were known for many years. Under Barack Obama, we lost our edge in the world. Our friends and allies no longer trusted us, and our enemies no longer feared us. So I advocate for a bold, a strong national defense. I propose a dramatic increase in particularly our Navy. I saw today that the Chinese are going to have twice our Navy in terms of number of ships by 2030, from what I saw. So we need to bolster national defense. We need to cut non-defense spending by 75%. And we need to, this is a 3-minute.
I'm sorry, yes. Regular answers are a minute and a half. This is 3.
No problem. I thought I was going a little quick. So, and I'll try to talk a little faster. So basically, our nation we have a unique responsibility, I think, in the world to promote and support liberty and to oppose tyranny. And we should deal with countries, put them on a freedom scale where our friends and allies are on the positive side and our enemies and adversaries on the negative side. And depending on where a country is, we treat them with our military might and our economic might. We encourage them to go in the right direction on the freedom scale and to promote more liberty in their nations. So with that, we would take a strong stand against China, who's been waging economic warfare against us for decades, and resist that or retaliate decisively against that. North Korea, we should insist on a denuclearized state that's reunited with South Korea, denuclearize Iran, and we need to defend Israel as our best ally in the Middle East, and basically acknowledge, like Kurdistan, as a nation consisting of portions of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. So that's about all the time I have. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is John Marshall Mosser. I'm also running for Congress, as I believe most of the county is. My background is in financial services and law. I'm a business lawyer by training. I've served as an executive for the largest accounting firm headquartered in the state, and I served as counsel for the largest bank headquartered in the state. And I did that while Dodd-Frank was coming online. So I have seen firsthand how the good banks, not the ones that got bailed out, were forced to adapt to new regulations that, frankly, were imposed on banks regardless of their size and regardless of whether or not they were involved in the financial crisis. So I take a very domestic view of issues. My primary interest is in the fiscal soundness of our country, and my primary concern is our debt and the fact that we are not really talking about sustainable ways to pay it back, and we are also not addressing Social Security and entitlement reform, and all of that is going to hit us in about 10 years. We're going to have essentially a Social Security that is presently insolvent. It's been insolvent since 2011. The reason we haven't noticed it is the fact that it's sitting on an 80-year surplus. That's going to peak in 2020, and then it's all downhill from there. And in 2030 or 2035, depending on who you believe, we're going to have to cut benefits on all people receiving Social Security by about 26% unless we do something about it. But as this is the foreign policy debate, I will pivot slightly. My background in international isn't from the business side. I received my international MBA and law degree from the University of South Carolina. As those of you from South Carolina probably know, the international MBA program is the top ranked program in the country for that. I was fortunate enough to go study in Germany and work in London for a time with a multinational software company. With offices in Hong Kong, South Africa, Singapore, and I've also been fortunate enough to travel extensively. From a policy perspective, I agree that we need to maintain peace through strength. I think as conservatives, we would all like to live and let live and frankly have the rest of the world leave us alone. But we tried that after World War I, and we got Pearl Harbor bombed. So I think we've conclusively demonstrated that isolationism is not a viable strategy, so we need to maintain a presence in the world, both economically to support export of our values, because a lot of other countries do not share our values around the world. and we should serve as a shining city on the hill, an example to them, and you know, military where necessary, peace through strength. We've attempted to lead from behind for the past 8 years, and that has led to a world on the verge of chaos. So 2 years of peace through strength has us closer to peace than 8 years of leading from behind. So that's the policy I would advocate.
Hi, I'm Shannon Pierce, and I'm running for Congress. And I'm running as a conservative to conserve 3 main values, and it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the reason I say that is I know that you're going to hear that from people, but those people don't know me. I'm not a career politician. I'm a mom, nurse. I did start a technology company, an entrepreneur, and I do like to make a difference. But folks don't have a voting record for me, and I think you need to trust the person that's going to represent you. And so there's 50 issues that we can speak to. And what I've noticed over the course of the campaign is most of us agree on most of the issues, but life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, life, I believe that starts with a strong economy, and you have to have a strong economy to be able to defend our borders and to have a strong national security. So life, I think, is incredibly important. That also translates over to protecting the unborn, and I'm consistent when it comes to life. Anything for life. And I think that there's some people in our party sometimes where people think that you care about life when they're little but not when they're older. I'm for dignity in life, and I guess as a nurse, that's something that's always been important to me. So consistently, I'll make decisions that protect human life. Liberty. Our Constitution was a flawlessly written document, and I believe that we enjoy the benefits of that today, but when I look at how short that document is and how powerful, I think that that is where our liberty comes from. And so I will vote consistent with that document, and I'm not about changing anything in our Constitution, but I'm about upholding it. And then the pursuit of happiness. It's so important that every American and everyone that's here can pursue that, but that's not something that somebody else can give to you. It's something that you have to even know what good looks like, what you dream for, and then you have to believe that that there's a pathway that you can take to get there. And so not someone that's about equity of opportunity. I think we have a lot of people that think just because they went to college that they deserve a 2-car garage and a picket fence. You don't. You have to create value for people for them to be able to pay you, and you have to earn more than what somebody's paying you to be of substance. But I do believe that each person was created for a reason, and they have to believe that they can be better, and they have to be rewarded for the good work that they do and believe that they can be all that they can be. So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness, directly for me, that's healthcare as a nurse, but then also education are 2 places that I would focus mainly on the campaign. And then as far as foreign policy goes, as a businesswoman and someone who has traveled, not as extensively as you, but a bit, in Israel for workforce development. My husband's from England. I do totally believe that diplomacy and commerce is the best way for us to make friends around the world. I think by giving clean water to someone and by showing them how they can produce for themselves and dream, that they're closer to get there. Thanks.
Hello. So I'm going to be a little bit informal. I'm Justin David Sanders, a little rough around the edges. I'm not also a career politician. Born and raised here in Greenville, South Carolina. Graduated from Greenville High 50 years after my grandfather did on my father's side. He graduated in 1952. I graduated in 2002. My roots are deep here. I care about the district. I did leave for a while. I went to Texas. I joined the military. Stationed at Fort Hood, and then from there I went to Iraq for 2 years, spent 27 months in Iraq, not consecutively, with a year in between. So my foreign policy understanding comes a lot from the experience that I have in and around the world. I've also traveled to India, to Mexico. I've seen where the world is compared to where we are. We're very lucky here. We are extremely lucky, and it weighs on me, and it puts the burden on my conscience, on my heart, to want to do more for the people around me. When I came back from Iraq, I went immediately into school, Greenville Tech first, then transferred to University of South Carolina, where I got a degree in political science, studying the theory of politics from ancient ancient times to modern times, from Plato to Thomas Paine and the Founding Fathers. And I also have an extensive study in economics as well. I believe that's the future of political theory, because we're a globalized society now. Everything is becoming interconnected. That also plays into foreign policy as well, understanding how much of our wealth is derived from trade with other nations. With that, we have to protect ourselves. We have to protect our trade interests. We have to protect our district's interests. And that's why I want to run. I feel I have a different perspective on life. I think that rights are a responsibility, that we need to hold up a mirror to ourselves and ask, what are we doing to promote equality in the district? What are we doing to promote what we want to see? And while I'm doing this, and while I've spoke with many people after coming back from Iraq, because my entire life changed after that. To digress, I spent my 12 years in secondary and primary school in 9 different schools. I have not the storied history that most people have. I wasn't born with a silver spoon, and that has led me to speak with a lot of different people. And I understand that we need to make decisions based on where do we see ourselves in the future. So I'm running for Congress, for U.S. Congress, to say that I have a perspective for our future, and if you're willing to understand and listen to me, we can build a better future for everybody. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you to the host for having this event. I know you guys ran into some headwinds in pulling this thing off, and maybe you'll elaborate about that later, but thank you for doing it, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to talk with you for a few minutes. Fellow candidates did a good job so far this evening. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a retired Army colonel. I spent 31 years in service of the country. I have lived around the world, including in many of the hot spots. I've had a distinct honor and privilege of commanding American troops in combat zones. I've seen the hardship and the courage that requires. And it's a memory that I'll never forget. In the course of that, I had a chance to participate in many senior decisions having to do with foreign policy. I've had a chance to sit down with foreign leaders and talk about their issues in their country, how they can improve their culture, if they can improve their culture, how they can improve their armed forces. I've seen the ugly side of it. I've been at Dover for honor ceremonies of our killed in action. I've been many times for a long period of time at Andrews Air Force Base receiving our wounded in action. So I know the consequences of war. But I know the reasons for war. So I look forward to the opportunity to talk about foreign policy this evening. I will quickly say that I'm running on 3 primary issues. One of them is American security, which is a lot of what we'll probably be talking about here tonight. I do feel that the gap between us and key adversaries is closing. And it's up to us to make sure that doesn't happen. Secondly, American businesses and workers. As has been said by one of my colleagues, the American economy, the strength of it, the prospects of it in the future are essential to national security. Lastly, the American way of life. Without the way of life that we have, our strength will be undermined. So part of what we're doing is preserving our way of life, taking care of our businesses and workers to make sure that we've got the resources and the know-how and the ability to protect the security of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The War Powers Act makes an argument on the limits of the president's authority to use military force. It reads, in part, the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce the United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories, or possessions, or its armed forces. Do you agree with this understanding of the Constitution that the only reason for the President to use military force without express congressional authorization is an emergency caused by attack on the United States? I'll start with John Marshall.
No, I do not. I believe, as Ronald Reagan did and every other president since the War Powers Resolution was passed, that it's an unconstitutional usurpation of the president's authority. For example, if Americans were attacked and detained somewhere abroad, the theory behind the War Powers Resolution would essentially say, you may be the U.S. president, you may command our army, you may command our navy, but you can't go rescue Americans without Congress's permission. I think if you go back and you look to our founding documents, the Constitutional Convention, it was very, very clear that the Congress was given the power to declare war, not the power of war. The entire executive is vested in the president. He has the entire diplomatic through the ambassadors. He has the entirety of the Army and the Navy, now the entirety of the armed forces. And frankly, in terms of institutional competency, we can't get our Congress to balance a budget, much less figure out how they're going to rescue Americans abroad or whether or not we should or should not engage in a tactical missile strike.
I did some research for this debate. So if I just heard your question before I did the research, I would be inclined to nod and to say, yeah, that makes sense to me. It's constitutional, and when you read it, like, it's there, but there's very little in the Constitution on it. But then when I did more research, I saw that the last time that the Congress gave approval for a war before we went to fight was World War II. And what I thought that was a little messed up, and started to dig a little bit more and to see if that was true, but it is. And when I started, and then I think in 1973 there was a resolution that said that if a president declares war, then in 60 days the Congress either supports it or they can say no. But in the entirety since World War II, and then after that in 1973, no one's changed it. And as an individual, that I've never fought and I've never served alongside these men. So that's one of the main reasons that I'm here today, is to listen and to learn. And so I know that they'll be able to say more than I can. But I have children that are fighting age, and so I believe that war is something to be avoided at all costs whenever possible. My dad came back from Vietnam broken from that. So anytime that somebody says yes to a war, there's a few things I think we need to be sure of as a country, but one is we're going to win it, and we need to know, and we need to define a win in advance. And then two, if we draw a red line and say we're going to do something, we have to be strong and stand behind it. But looking back since World War II, I know that there's wars that we fought that have been just, but I think that there's a lot that we fought without a way to win it or to define how to win it, and I think that's where we failed.
I'm sorry, the question was about the strikes in Syria, because it was prefaced by a lot of war powers.
This question was not specifically about that, although we did reference the War Powers Resolution, this wording from the War Powers Resolution in our statement on Syria. The question was, do you agree with this understanding of the Constitution, that the only reason for the president to use military force without express congressional authorization is an emergency caused by an attack on the United States?
Yeah, that sounds pretty close to, the thing is, for me, I understand, being in it, it takes centralized decision-making to strike when you need to. Sometimes that decision-making is, the onus of it is powerful and extremely hard to do, and I feel that the way that we have structured the balance of power between the legislature and the president by precedence right now is on par with what we're trying to accomplish in the world. I believe that, yes, what you said is constitutionally correct, but I also understand that everything is case dependent, and it's important to understand what we're trying to do in the world when we make a decision like this, and the repercussions, the unintended consequences as well as the intended consequences.
Thank you. This issue is one that's been debated and discussed essentially since the nation's founding and before. There's always a tension between the executive and the legislature, and if you have a judiciary branch, By and large, the concepts and philosophy of preemptive war have superseded limitations that have been put on by a legislature. So, for instance, if the president in our country decides that there's an imminent threat, he has taken that authority. The challenge in our country in recent history has become a number of issues or a number of conflicts like Kosovo or Somalia, in cases like this that are borderline issues where there's no clear threat to the United States of America. So there you've seen tension between the legislature and the president. And of course, Vietnam, at the end of Vietnam, you saw a lot of tension with the War Powers Resolution Act to try to prohibit President Nixon and then President Ford to continue any offensive actions or conflict in Vietnam. If you look at the constitutional history, it's interesting to declare war portion. There's no declaration of war in the Constitution, but it's declare war. Madison's notes, when they were talking about that, and Madison's notes are the single most exhaustive exploration of what occurred at the Constitutional Convention and how they came to these decisions. They had a debate about that, and initially they wanted to use the term make war in the Constitution, but they felt that would be a little bit too prohibitive on the executive, so they ended up going to the term declare war, and that's what they voted on and, of course, ratified, as you know.
Well, I'm grateful that I am going last on this one because I get to completely reiterate what John Marshall said. You can replay what he said, and I'm going to add to that. Basically, the War Powers Act is extra-constitutional, and war powers are defined by our Constitution. Congress is the only authority for declaring war. But just because offensive action is taken doesn't mean that it's a declaration of war. And sometimes the defensive action involves an offensive proactive action. So there's no intent by our founders to hamstring the president by doing such a thing as having Congress determine when the president can exercise his authority as commander-in-chief of the armed services. And basically, it would be a disaster if we had that. Congress is so spineless, they can't, like John Marshall said, they can't even pass a budget. So we have to recognize that this act has never been tested as a constitutional, it's never been a constitutional test. And I completely disagree with the statement that you read. And basically, I don't advocate for just going and doing anything, but Congress has the authority. They have the power of the purse. They can impeach the president. And then there are polls that the people can vote and make their choice known then. So the balance of powers works very well, and we should stay with that.
With the nomination of Gina Haspel to be CIA director, the issue of waterboarding is back in the news. As a CIA station chief, she oversaw waterboarding and other enhanced interrogation techniques. In a 2007 executive order, President Bush reaffirmed the U.S. position against torture, and in 2009, President Obama issued directives explicitly banning waterboarding. Do you believe waterboarding constitutes torture? And is there ever a situation where U.S. intelligence, the military, contractors, or third parties with U.S. cooperations may justly apply torture? And we'll begin with Ms. Pierce.
This is one I researched too. And I was not waterboarded to research it, but I've talked to people and soldiers that have been, though. And actually, my finance director was a Citadel person who experienced a little bit of it. And on the way over, I asked him, was that torture? And he said it wasn't fun. And but he's okay now, and he survived that. And so I know that it was my little brothers when we were little, they talked to me about the Geneva Conventions and wooden bullets and why those were illegal and how soldiers that were doing their job would suffer and how it took years sometimes or months for them to die slow, horrible deaths. So anyone that I know that's fought war does not believe that torture should be allowed. And when you were talking about countries that are like us, that in free countries and free societies, and people that participate with us, I think that most of the world would frown on torture. But I know that right now there are people that are in prison that are experiencing much more than waterboarding. So if we think that it's torture, then no, I don't want to torture folks. But also as a mom, I thought about that. What if someone had one of my sons, and if I dripped water in their nose, I could find out where my sons were? I could probably sleep with myself and live with myself for that. So I think it totally depends on what the desired result is and what we're trying to achieve. And depending upon that, you use the resources that you have on hand to be able to achieve that desired result. So if I was waterboarded right now, I wouldn't like it, but I'd survive it. And so I think it depends on the circumstance. And I actually think we have a great CIA director now, too.
I do believe it's torture. That simulates death, simulates drowning. I don't think that anybody in here would want to undergo it. But for me, I think that where do we want to see ourselves? Again, like I said, I want to hold up the mirror to everybody, to myself included. And I don't think that we need to stand on that kind of footing. We want to move forward in the country or in the world as a leader, so we have to stand on righteous values. We want to respect life, so we need to have dignity for life, and we need to understand that we have to give. Some all give some and some give all, as it were. Lucky I only had to give some. And I wouldn't want to be the one ordered to go and extract that information from people, but I understand that stronger men are able to do that back when it was needed during extreme times. But I still feel that it's torture and that we shouldn't relegate ourselves to those kind of practices when there may be another way. I understand that time is constrained in a lot of these issues, so we take the easy way out, and I believe that's an easy way out.
That's a tough question that's been around, of course, since shortly after 9/11. The way I come down on that is that I do not consider it to be torture, because generally speaking, the decisions about torture and definition of torture have entailed a permanent and death-producing potentiality, and that is not the case of waterboarding. Doesn't mean I like it, doesn't mean I want to do it very often, but I also don't think it really matters, because what matters in the end is the security of our country and the preservation of our freedom. Waterboarding was done on a very small number of people. We can say that we're against torture, but everybody in this room would accept the administration of torture under certain circumstances. If I told you that there was a nuclear bomb in this building, we could kill everybody in Greenville, and the only way to determine where that bomb was and defuse it would be to torture somebody in this room that we knew where that bomb was, and we had a limited amount of time to do that. You would agree. You'd want it done. So these things are always a question of consequences in degree. What's the total effect? What is the mission? What are you trying to preserve? And if the security of the United States is at risk, and we just had several thousand people killed by a terrorist attack in New York City and Washington, there's a lot of things that we're willing to do.
my granddaughter thinks it's torture to be told to clean up her room. And so torture is a relative term, and I don't like equating torture with waterboarding. I think the question basically did that, but the question was really, is waterboarding torture? We should be against torture. I agree with Colonel Schmid that there's that human element when you know somebody knows, and you just will do anything and everything to get the information out of them. You know, we would all probably gravitate toward that. You know, our human inclination would be to do that, but that's not, you know, that's not what we're talking about in matters of national security and war. Waterboarding should be part of the bag of tricks, the toolbox that our folks use in national security to extract information, and it's only used selectively. And basically, the United States should withdraw from the United Nations and repudiate any international agreement that isn't in our national interest. I advocate for booting the UN out of our country and separating countries into friends and allies and enemies and adversaries, and get NATO to recommit and expand our reach and have the good guys and the bad guys. And basically, we should not have any kind of world order over our national sovereignty. Every nation has the right to repudiate any agreement that's been made, because we can't bind the hands of our posterity. And I'm not advocating for torture, but I do think waterboarding should be permitted.
I don't know there's much else to add there. I think the concept is it torture or is it not torture? Let's take a starting principle that we do this to our own soldiers. Soldiers that undergo SEER training are, in fact, waterboarded. They come out of that soldiers not permanently maimed or killed. So it's obviously not something that's desirable to do, but to the extent that we're willing to do it to our own forces as training, and that they're willing to undergo it, and the people that have been through it advocate that people that continue to go through that training continue to experience the same training. I think that's a compelling argument to do it, obviously in certain limited circumstances. There was a thought experiment that I believe one of the professors that objected to Haspel's nomination went through, and he essentially went through that there's a nuclear bomb somewhere, in a major U.S. citizen. The person who knows this information is in front of you. Would you waterboard them? Most people would say yes. The person's spouse is in the other room. Would you waterboard them? Less people say yes. The person's children are in the next room. Would you waterboard them? Virtually no one says yes. So, I think we can go through a thought experiment as to where we ought to draw the line in terms of morality. I think in terms of torture, our argument against doing it is that we don't want it done to our soldiers. So to the extent that we are engaging in conduct that is not going to permanently maim or kill, but it's going to give us useful information in certain circumstances, it should be permitted.
And I just have a follow-up on that. Would you agree that what our soldiers experience in SEER training, as far as the waterboarding, is significantly different than what was applied as far as the frequency? My understanding is the SEER training, and that's survival, evasion, rescue, and escape. It's a specialized training that's given to special forces soldiers, to our CIA, people like that, people who have a good risk of being captured. And would you agree that, the frequency, the duration of that, my understanding is that it's significantly different. I don't know if you have a different.
Honestly, I'm not informed enough to say. I understand that waterboarding was done on a certain limited number of individuals after 9/11, but as it compares to SEER training, I couldn't speak intelligently about that.
So next question. If you're elected to Congress, one of your most important decisions will be the election of the Speaker of the House. The Speaker has tremendous power. He can even influence whether an issue makes it to the floor for debate, as Paul Ryan did with the Syria strikes. What foreign policy qualifications will you look for in a candidate for Speaker? I'll start with Justin Sanders.
Extensive knowledge. I think that when you get to Congress, you are bombarded with as much knowledge as you can handle, which is important for anybody going. And we all, not one of us, can know everything. But in positions of leadership like that, when you have control over the calendar and what makes it to the House floor, then you need to have a lot of institutional memory at your back. So experience, extreme amount of experience, which is one of the reasons why I'm not happy with everybody talking about term limits. I'm not one for term limits because we need personal, individual responsibility. It is your responsibility to vote out and vote in Congress members. If they're not doing what you want them to do, then vote them out. You need to get into your neighborhoods and talk to people. That's a foundation of our democracy, is communicating, politicking, discussing, talking to one another. And so I would talk with the leadership and find out who has the most qualification in foreign policy, who has the outlook that I would want to see. Where are we going in the future? Which leader is going to promote a safer, better America?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Who would be Speaker? Before I give you an answer on that, I've gotten questions before from citizens about who I thought should be Speaker and asked for a specific name, and I've always declined to do that because I felt like I'm a handshaking, eye-to-eyeball kind of guy. I want to meet people before I'm going to recommend them, and I want to talk to them before I'm going to tell them, you have my vote. However, in general, I would say qualifications for Speaker are the essential quality of leadership. You need to perceive that individual as being a strong leader, a intelligent person, sound conservative principles, and a team builder, because the Speaker, nor is anybody in Washington a dictator, they've got to be able to build a team. They've got to be able to work with others. So those characteristics are essential. I would add two other things. One, you probably want them to be in a relatively safe district or from a relatively safe district, because the speakership is a hard job. We can tell from what's occurred in recent history. So probably that person should be from a relatively safe district, if possible, so that he wouldn't have to worry as much about local level politics as the average congressman or woman must. Lastly, I would like for him to be a veteran, because if you look at the statistics, 50 years ago, 80% of the elected officials were veterans. Today, it's less than 20. And I don't think that's too healthy for our country. We need to have more veterans in service, and especially more veterans at leadership positions.
We have a huge problem with the Speaker of the House and other leaders in the House having way too much power. Paul Ryan, in my opinion, needs to go, and he needs to go immediately. My first choice right now, with everything I know, would be Jim Jordan. And you know, the rule that when you get to Congress as a freshman congressman, and we're going to have a freshman congressman from this district, and the rule that the only rule you don't violate is the Republican House Rules Committee or something like that. I learned of that when the omnibus fiasco was passed, and I was shocked. I mean, what on earth are they thinking? We're supposed to go to Congress and give up our power right out the gate, and thankfully 25 congressmen bucked the system at that point. As far as qualifications for the, well, we need to transfer power away from those that have it back to the states from the federal government, to all the congressmen from leadership, to Congress from the courts, and in some cases, definitely the federal bureaucracy. And, you know, and I lost my train of thought on the other, I was going somewhere. But, you know, moving power away from where it's centralized, and you know, holding Congress and especially leadership accountable is what we need to do as voters. And as congressmen that go to Congress, we have to be willing to buck the system and take a stand on what's right.
I think the most important qualification for the next speaker is going to be their willingness to balance the budget. So with due respect to your question, I think their foreign policy experience, their foreign policy thoughts are to me less important than whether they recognize the dire financial straits that our country is in right now and are willing to commit to making that better. I think the problem that we've had is that all of the incentives in Washington are set up in the wrong direction. It's all set up to spend, none of it's set up to save, none of it's set up to make hard choices, because people that make hard choices tend to get voted out of office. So I think what we need in a speaker is the same thing that we need in a congressman. I think we need to recognize that the fundamental problem that our country has right now is financial, and we've got a very narrow window to fix it. Again, all of this essentially is going to hit us in 10 years, and our opportunity to fix it is now. So if we do not have someone that is committed to balancing the budget now, not this weird Washington idea of a budget that balances in 10 years, because they never balance and everyone agrees that they never balance, that really is the most essential component. I think we need to have someone that's willing to say, listen, if you want to spend $250 million and we want to spend $250 million, we can't compromise on spending $500 million we don't have, much less $500 billion, much less $21 trillion.
Yeah. In researching this one too, because they did not tell us what the questions were going to be, but they bulleted them for us. So I researched Speaker in the House and who gets elected Speaker to the House and what are the qualifications that people look for. And it's sick. Do you know what gets you elected Speaker of the House? Who can raise the most money for the party? That's the truth. And that's the criteria. And then the second one is will you be a puppet? And it didn't word it quite like that, but that's pretty much what it is. So if you can work the phones really well and you'll be a puppet, then you're going to be Speaker of the House. And then to whoever is elected, we will be a freshman congressperson. And I've had a lot of people, and I visited D.C. back in February before I put my name in the hat. And folks were pretty clear that if you want to do well in this town, then you're going to do exactly kind of what we want you to do, and that you won't be on a committee, you won't do things unless that's the case. And my first question was, well, what about Trey Gowdy? He was a freshman, and he was head of the Oversight Committee. How did that happen? And they got kind of quiet and just said, well, there's no power on the Oversight Committee, to which I kind of pushed back a little bit. So there are some names that we could go through, and like you, I'd want to meet them first, but I definitely would want to have someone that would listen to the people, and that's a very systemic problem solver and is an American before they're a Republican, but somebody that really speaks on behalf of the House is what I would look for. But not who the person is that can raise the most money. I don't think that should be the qualifier.
In response to an alleged chemical attack by President Assad, the U.S. launched air and missile strikes against facilities in Syria. The administration cited the authorization of use of force originally passed in 2001, which has been used as authorization for military action in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Niger, and the Philippines. Do you believe that this authorization actually pertains to the U.S. actions in Syria, and do you believe the strikes were wise?
I don't think it was intended for the act in Syria as far as the strike is concerned against Assad's chemical assets. I think that was an interpretation by the Trump administration that was probably beyond was beyond the intent and letter of that authorization. However, I'm not surprised he did that, and other presidents have taken action that went beyond the widespread interpretation of a rule. It is important to point out that for foreign policy, the single most important criteria, two most important criteria, is the strength of your nation and the credibility of your leader. Our previous president lost a lot of credibility for a number of reasons around the world. Our present president has reestablished that, in fact, has so strongly reestablished that in some areas, it looks like he might be able to negotiate some remarkable changes in places like Korea, potentially revisiting and renegotiating an approved deal in Iran, and certainly the expenditures of the European governments on their defense budgets. So the president made a lot of progress. Credibility is extremely important. He drew a line. It would have been against his interest not to enforce that line, and in his understanding, the interest of the United States.
I know there are a lot of questions about those strikes because as you looked at the media, the conservative media, good people disagreed. It was almost evenly split. And, you know, I won't pretend to have all the answers, but I can tell you that Congress should declare war on radical Islamic terrorism and thereby give the president the authority to conduct that war. It's asymmetric. It can happen anywhere. It's always going to be there. We are at war with radical Islamic terrorism. Whether we want to admit it or not, they are at war with us. So in the case of the chemical attack, is it possible that the rebels would gas themselves in order to bring rain terror down on the Assad regime? Yeah, that's possible. But we can't second guess what the president knows and doesn't know, what our intelligence knows. And you know, it was probably a little bit overdone, and particularly the first attack when the president first came into office. But we have to, as a people, we have to recognize that we have responsibility to stand up for those that are, you know, the Bible says in Proverbs 24:11 and 12, you know, it warns us that if we forbear from delivering those that are drawn unto death or those that are ready to be slain, or if we say, you know, behold, we knew it not, we basically invite the judgment of God upon us. And that's as individuals, but I think as Americans, we need to be the champions of peace and liberty, and the you know, we can't do it universally around the world because we'd be at war with China over their human rights abuses. So we can't do it in all cases, but we should be open to proactive action against, for example, rescuing the Yazidis. Obama committed a grievous sin by not going in and rescuing those poor people that were on that hillside.
I think as to the specific question, the answer is probably that it exceeded the mandate, that it was outside of the scope. However, as I said earlier in the question related to the War Powers Resolution, there's a reason that the executive power is vested in the president. There's a reason that he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So if he, with the entire national security apparatus, believes that to be in the national security interest of the United States, then I think it's permitted. The question is, what is Congress's role in that? And Congress's role essentially is the power of the purse. Philosophically, again, glad to talk about this, but the role of the Congress in war power and war decision-making is to declare war, which we know they haven't done. So they essentially act as an armchair quarterback in this regard. And in the armchair quarterback role, they control the power of the purse. So if they want to control whether or not the president engages in these strikes, they cannot pass a $1.3 trillion omnibus that gives him carte blanche with a blank check. I think any of us sitting here have a serious information deficiency from which we could speak to whether or not that was wise. I think you have to be inside the room to understand what is known. My understanding is that we made great efforts not to hit any of our allies or get anywhere close to Russia or get anywhere close to anything that might spark a larger conflict. And we thought that there was a national security interest at stake. So I don't know what's turned Trey Gowdy's hair that color of white, but I imagine he knows things the rest of us don't.
Yeah, I think I agree with these gentlemen. Our president is not an interventionist, and he was one of the few who suggested that we did not go back to Iraq and go into to fight Iraq before there was a war. So when I saw that the red line was drawn and saw that he intervened, you know, I'm just looking from television, watching like the rest of the world. But what I did notice is that we were with the UK, that we were with France, that we had Germany, we had our European allies, we had the UN say that they stood behind us in what we did. And when I look at who spoke against it, it was Assad, China, Russia, Iraq, and Iran. even neighbors like Jordan, Israel, of course, but Turkey were supportive of that intervention. And I believe that if we had someone with gas at our borders, we'd probably want it to be stopped pretty soon too. So that's when we're looking from a side, like it's hard to know, we don't have the information, but I do believe that our president did, and I believe in that case, just from looking at the people that are closer and what they said, I think the right decision was made there.
I don't have, again, second that opinion. I don't have the information necessary to be able to analyze it efficiently, effectively enough to have a explicit answer there for whether or not it was overreaching or not. But I will say I agreed with it. I liked the fact that we did. I think, actually I know President Obama had a chance to do the same thing. He drew the line under his presidency and went to Congress for approval first, and they denied him. This time, there's a lot of discussion about being a police around the world, but studying history and knowing the evolution of man, I believe that we have an obligation to stand up for what is right. We stand up for our morals and our values and what we believe in, and believing that humans are dignified and deserve the same rights as we have, then we need to start exporting that. And to do that, we have to be strong in our decisions, and we have to take decisive actions. Again, it ties in with the torturing and the waterboarding. It's not something that we would want to do personally, but it's something that saves time when we're short on it, which we are.
Before I ask this next question, I want to say that I am impressed and thankful for the willingness of the candidates to come here and answer the questions. I know with some of you, this may not be the area of knowledge, that you have the most knowledge in. For others, it's not your primary area of focus, but I think that it is something that we look for and should look for, to know something about what our congressmen would do and what they think about these things. And we appreciate your willingness to come here and answer our questions. This next question relates to free trade. And I'll say the Republican Party's position on free trade looks like it might be changing, but Republicans still tend to value free trade. My question is, what effect should a foreign government's hostile actions toward the U.S. or its violation of foreign government's violations of human rights have on its ability to engage in international trade? I'll start with Colonel Schmid.
Another good question. I think in foreign affairs, you've got to consider that government has multiple tools at its disposal. War being the last tool that we'd like to see our nation employ. So what do we have in addition to that? We've got diplomatic, we've got informational, we've got economic. It's called the dime principle in the military community. So economic, one of those is trade. So if we can influence another power in a favorable way or unfavorable way by use of a trade limitation or restriction, that's something that is and often should be considered. I encourage that. I think that the value of trade restrictions is a lot of times overestimated, sanctions and embargoes and so forth. Generally speaking, in this complex international world that we have, there are ways around those things. However, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be tried. I don't think that there really is or ever has been such a thing as free trade. It's a word that's often thrown around, but in reality, when you look in the details, there's been very little free trade, if by free trade you mean entirely open and entirely unrestricted. We have restrictions on imports. Others have more restrictions generally on imports than we do. So when that's come up on the campaign, I've usually kind of dismissed it as, let's be realistic. Trade is important. We want to encourage trade, but sometimes free trade is not the right approach, and we need to pursue fairness, and we need to pursue our own economic interests first.
In my book, The Albert Plan to Save America, I point out that there's no such thing as free trade. It's a myth, and fair trade is a myth. Basically, you know, like Colonel Schmid said, there's nobody that's ever experienced free trade. And frankly, here in the United States, we don't have free trade within our country. I appreciate Captain Bell, by the way. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your contribution to this race. And I had a conversation with him, and we had a conversation about free trade. And I pointed out to him that we do not have it in this country, and he was pointing out interstate trade, but yet we don't have the liberty to do what we are God ordained to do, to create wealth, to prosper, and to have the liberty to, you know, just look at all the restrictions we have, the suppression of output and everything that's happened in this country. So it used to be that, you know, what was good for American Motors was, or General Motors was good for the country. But big business is, they're even boasting now countries, you know, companies, not countries. So their objective is to dominate the world. The large companies are on a quest to do that. It's part of the globalist model that they're pursuing. And you know, as far as restricting a nation from doing trade, all we can do is sanction a nation ourselves. We never should have given China most favored nation status with their human rights violations. And look what we have now. They're beating us right and left, and they're going to suppress us militarily if we don't watch out. And we have to use trade as a strategic. I advocate for strategic, secure trade.
In answer to your question, I believe in rational free trade. I believe that we should promote free trade to the extent possible. However, we shouldn't pursue it as an economic principle to the exclusion of our reason. So we have a specially designated national list of terrorists that we don't do business with. Those people should be on that list. We should not be offering them access to the American financial system if they're going to use it to engage in terrorism. I agree that the same principle should be applied on a broader standard to nations. To the extent that we have nations behaving irresponsibly, supporting terrorist dictators, murdering innocents, we don't want to go to war with them to prevent them from doing these things each time. It's much more rational for us to engage in trade sanctions with them, such an extent that we're trying to export our values to the world. Now, people can argue that we shouldn't be trying to export our values to the world, but I'm not one of those. I think we have a comprehensive set of values in our nation that is head and shoulders above many of the other nations of the world, and that's American exceptionalism. So we need to be exporting that value, and if we can do it via trade, that is much better than doing it via war or the sword. Similarly, with nations that are engaged in cheating in trade, we can adjust our trade deals with them in such a way to achieve a desired result. So for example, we import a lot of European cars. We pay about a 2.5% tariff. Europeans pay a 10.5% tariff on our exports. So Europe is an ally, but they should rationalize our trade deals.
ABC, when you're a nurse or in healthcare, when you're surveying a situation, they tell you to triage. So you look at airway, breathing, and circulation. And when I think of trade, this is something where we have to be sure. And the same thing on an airplane, if you have an infant, they tell you to put the oxygen on the infant first before you start doing something. And so when I think of America and I think of our economy and our national security, I think that we have to focus there first. When I look at trade, it looks like that and I definitely think that we should work on trade sanctions prior to war, definitely. And so maybe the triage would be, you know, impact their trade, then waterboarding, then war. Like I'm not sure, but whatever it takes to get the desired result. When I started exploring just in our district, because if I'm elected to represent you as your congressperson, then what I'm supposed to do is listen to the people of the 4th Congressional District and see what the impact of every decision is on our citizens and to represent our citizens in D.C. And looking at the trade, if we were in an agriculture district where that was the main thing, we could have some very negative impacts from what President Trump had proposed. Also, with the automotive manufacturing that we have here, cheap steel is good for our district. So the more that I started to look, the more I realized that I needed to know to represent the district here to see how that is and how it plays out. And there's not a really simple answer, but as an American, as a conservative, I totally believe in free trade, but with big business, sometimes what is called free trade is not free trade, and the smaller businesses have their hands tied, and the people are penalized that are doing the right things, and the people that are doing the wrong things get the benefits. So it's really looking a little bit more.
So there is no easy answer. That's correct. Everything is very convoluted and interdependent. When it comes to trade, I believe trade can be a carrot. Access to our economy can incentivize countries to act accordingly. And it doesn't even have to be our economy. It can be the Western world, Europe. Anybody that wants to join in, like the UN, if they could get it together, using trade to get people to act the way they ought to act. Again, there's incentives. You can either coerce people, or you can punish or reinforce positive behavior. And I think access to trade, can be used that way. So again, to speak to your question though, we definitely need to use our access to our trade as a way of limiting the countries that are not willing to go along with what we want and what we feel is in our best interest, in the world's best interest, to do trade with them. And we need to gather everybody together that feels the same way and work together in that process to limit bad behavior and bad actors in our global economy.
So this question comes from the audience. What is your opinion of NATO, its current mission, and the continued membership of the U.S. in it? We'll start with Mr. Elbert.
As I said earlier, I think the United States should withdraw from the United Nations for a lot of reasons. Their stance on Israel, depopulation of the earth, their objective to control population growth. They have the Strong Cities Network, the Agenda 2030, and there are a lot of good reasons to just completely withdraw from the United Nations. And I also said earlier that we should basically recommit and strengthen NATO and have the good guys on the side of NATO and let all the others do what they're going to do. And so NATO is, I know President Trump was not too high on NATO. I know the others aren't contributing what they should. And they should do that. But also we should, welcome the opportunity to expand our military capabilities and kind of provide some through what I call American enterprise zones with partnership between our military and private security forces, and host countries would invite us to go and participate. Then we can control our military assets and technology better than we do now. Saudi Arabia is an example of where I'm very concerned about what we do with Saudi Arabia. So yes, reinforce our ties with NATO, expand upon it. And Turkey should be, we should expel Turkey from NATO if they don't change the direction they're going in. They're going the wrong way on the freedom scale.
I think NATO has been a force for good since its founding. Obviously, the dynamics of global power have changed over the years. Pardon me. But I would still say that it plays a useful role in world security. It is much easier for us to have diplomatic alliances, to enforce again, American values and world values that are shared by similar thinking nations via the instrument of NATO. President Trump rightly noted that the United States should not and cannot continue to bear the primary financial burden of NATO. We are the furthest away from the threats that NATO was designed to counter. So the nations that are closer to it should be contributing more, and I think we're moving in the right direction as far as that's concerned. Turkey is obviously problematic. At this point, we have air bases in Turkey, and we've got to continue to consider how that's going to function. I think we would much prefer that they remain in the fold of NATO. We would much prefer to use our influence via NATO and our relationship with them to continue to maintain peaceful ties, and hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Yes. What's interesting to me about NATO is that Turkey is in, and then there's countries like the Ukraine or Bosnia that are on a waiting list to come in. And I don't understand the decision-making process there. So there's 29 countries that are in, some that I've never heard of, but then there's others that want to be there and that share and say that they want a democracy, that they want to be a republic, that they want freedom, and they're on a waiting list. So when they ask for our help, nobody comes. And so I think that's interesting, and it just shows that there's a lot of politics and a lot of stuff behind the scenes. How long do you have to be on a waiting list when you say that you want to be there? And then when I look at treaties, it's kind of the same approach that I have with regulations, that you look at what is the desired result and what are you trying to achieve. And so after World War II, I 100% can see why that was in our best interest to be there. And when we had a strong economy and we were the world's superpower as far as from an economy, I can see why we would pay more. But right now we're in a place where we're hemorrhaging, and we need, I believe, to look out for our country before we're taking care of everybody else's. And when we look at a treaty, we have to look, is it achieving the desired result? And if not, I don't think that we should sign things that last forever. I think there are things that should be reevaluated to ensure that we're aligned with the right people and we're still achieving the right thing for our country first.
I believe that NATO serves a purpose, that, again, it was a good organization when it started and continues to be a good organization. We are not, it's not one-sided. Obviously, we are paving the way, paying the way for it right now, but I enjoy what President Trump is doing and holding the feet to the fire. Again, it's a responsibility issue. Their countries need to be responsible for their defense as well, just as much as we need to be responsible for ensuring that Russia doesn't continue to play a mockery of democracy. He has his hands in everything, and it's obvious. He is thinking years in advance because he has the opportunity to. He doesn't have to change who's going to be in power over the years like we do and worry about who's going to come in next. He's been there for too many years and can make decisions based on those types of futures. So it's important that we maintain a strong presence in the region, and the countries that were in the Soviet bloc don't want to remain there and have joined together for a united front. And it's the same thing with trade. We can use those carrots to ensure that we bring more people underneath the umbrella of a positive, prosperous future.
I'm a supporter of NATO. I've served in Europe. I understand the value that it brings to our mutual defense internationally. North Atlantic Treaty Organization has been one of the longest, if not the longest, surviving effective alliance in our nation's history. Doesn't mean that the purpose of the alliance doesn't change. Doesn't mean that, as has been mentioned, that the president shouldn't try to pursue increased contributions. That generally the European countries contribute somewhere between 1% and 2% of their GDPs for national defense. The United States is around 3%. So we've been badgering them for decades to bring up their budget numbers, and I believe that they should. Alliances are always important. It's always a caution for a world power to discard alliances. If you look back at history, from the Peloponnesian League on forward, every power pursued alliances and tried to strengthen their alliances. So it's better to try to modify one and strengthen one to discard one. As far as other alliances around the world, same thing applies. If it's in our interest, we should pursue them. If they're no longer in our interest, or if we don't get the cooperation that we need, we try to modify them. But it all has to do with American security. What is in the interest of American security?
All right, and now this should be the fun round, if the candidates will help and make it fun. This is where they get to ask one other candidate a question. We'll start with Mr. Mosser.
Colonel Schmid, what do you think is our gravest national security threat at the moment?
I think that your comments about the budget are very important for the longer-term threat of the country. I believe as far as an imminent threat as a rival is concerned, a national rival, it's China. China has a rapidly growing economy. They have a rapidly growing military. They're putting more and more resources into their defense budgets and into their strategic systems. So as far as a world power rival goes, I would say China. Russia continues to be a potential problem, but I believe Russia's on a decline demographically and economically and is not likely to be a significant threat to us longer term, but they do have nuclear weapons. And of course, the international terrorist groups continue to be significant threats. But if you ask me to put a finger on one, I would say China.
I'd be happy to ask this of anyone, but may I ask it of Barry Bell?
Sure, why not?
He actually is a big reason that I'm here at this debate, because I knew I would learn a lot, and I think it's important to do. And I respect all of the men that are up here. But Barry, what should one of us have? What do you wish we said up here tonight, or is there something you would have said different?
I gave up the privilege to answer these questions, although I am thankful for them. But I think that I would have disagreed with probably 80 to 90% of what was spoken up here. So I've been biting my tongue, but I have to remind myself I gave up my privilege when I stepped out and endorsed Stephen. But I can have private conversations all day long. But thank you for that question.
Okay, so my question, I guess, for John Mosser, it's because you care so much about the budget and everything, in the event that you don't make it to Congress, what are your future plans for trying to correct the issue, to help get that taken care of?
Well, I hope the reason that I'm in this race is to call attention to that issue and the fact that I didn't think anyone was sufficiently paying attention to it. I think everyone is talking about the national debt. That's well and good that we should be talking about that. It's $21 trillion. But if we don't address Social Security, it doesn't really matter. So we have Social Security sitting on a surplus right now. That we built up over 80 years of having a 16-to-1 worker rate to retiree ratio when it started to a 3-to-1 ratio now. We're going to crest in 2020, and then it's going to be downhill from there. So we have $2.8 trillion that's sitting out there in theoretical surplus. That's actually part of the $21 trillion in national debt. So think about this for a second. We paid into Social Security via payroll taxes, and then Social Security went and bought bonds, and that's fine. That's a great and sound investment. But now the American taxpayers are going to pay that amount again, plus interest, because our government has been spending more money than it takes in. So we have a very, very short window of time. I hope by being a part of this race, I'm raising the issue to people's attention. I think part of the power of the role of whoever is in this position, there'll be a freshman congressman. If you're not playing ball, you might not be able to get on the CUSH committees. So what your power is as a congressman, in my view, is to bring that information back to the constituents, because I don't think anybody's been talking about this since Bush versus Gore. And I don't think the problem has gotten better since Bush versus Gore. It's only narrowed our window and narrowed our ability to phase that in. So I think we just have to keep talking about it, and I hope everyone up here will keep talking about it.
Thank you.
John Marshall, I've heard you say several times, and nobody else is talking about this, but I have written a book, and I've called out the global financial collapse that's coming. I've called out the debt. And when I was a student at the Harvard Business School, our national debt was about $3 trillion, and I was jumping up and down, very passionate about the problem then, and I had a lot of starry-eyed, glassy-eyed people that just didn't seem to care. So I'm with you, brother.
Apologize, I didn't know you in college. But I'm glad you're with me. So I'm glad you're with me. I apologize, I didn't know you were in college.
Can I actually ask a follow-up for that? Since it's, y'all both were saying very passionate about it. What then can the constituents of the 4th District do now to ensure that that we take care of the issue, that our congressperson who is elected, not just them, but the constituents themselves, what can we do to ensure, instead of writing a book or running for Congress, what can the individuals do to make sure this is taken care of?
I just want to field this. I feel like I'm monopolizing the microphone. I think that what we can do is educate our friends and neighbors, just anyone you talk to. I was getting a haircut the other day and started talking about why I was running for Congress, and it flabbergasted people that we are in one of the largest, most successful countries in the world. We have a resurgent economy. We have the tax cuts. Everybody feels in their own wallet like the economy is doing well. So they just are not appreciative of the fact that what it feels like in our wallet is not what it's going to feel like in 10 years, because we're thinking in the here and now. And that's fine. I mean, Congress is a 2-year role. But here's the deal. We can start talking about reform in terms of people that are 50 and younger, or people that are my age that are 40 and younger. It's going to look very, very different. But if we do not start talking about it, our only option is going to be to impact people that are currently receiving benefits. So we still have a little bit of phase time where we can say, all right, we're not going to touch anybody that's currently on benefits. We're only going to be talking about people that are phasing in. If we wait 10 years, then we're not going to be there. And I think, those of us that are in the room, obviously those of us that are on the stage have made a significant political commitment, but each of you in the room and anyone that's taking the time to listen is more politically involved than the average citizen. So if you're voting in the primary, you're more involved than, 90% of the rest of the citizens. So take what you're learning and take this information out and proselytize about it. Go spread the good word that this is a problem, and demand solutions.
How much time do I have? A couple minutes, or how much time? Well, I was going to reply to the budget point, since several of my colleagues got a chance to reply, and then I was going to ask a question, so that's why I'm asking how much time I have. 30-second follow-up. On the budget, I've proposed a couple of specific things that I think will begin the process of addressing this huge budget deficit and the national debt. Very briefly, I think we should have across-the-board federal budget freeze, all programs, including the primary entitlement programs. And each of those should be carefully reformed, subject to the approval of Congress, because Congress must approve these things, to make them more efficient and more focused on those in the greatest need. Because a lot of these entitlement programs, as everybody knows, at least in this room, I believe you know, go to folks that don't need them, or at least don't need them as bad as some others. Federal debt, I proposed a 10% tariff on all imported products. with the specific purpose of dedicating the revenues from that tariff rather, specifically to paying off the national debt. Now, for my question, if I may. I'd like to ask Shannon a question. Broadening the scope of the security discussion, because I believe immigration is also a matter of security, controlling immigration. Another event, I believe I heard you say something. I'd like to ask you if that's in fact your position or if I misunderstood it. I believe you indicated that in the course of a discussion on federalism, that you believe that states, if they so desired, cities within those states, if they so desire to declare themselves sanctuary cities, they should be allowed to do so as a principle of federalism. Could you address that, please?
Okay. Yes, you probably heard me on a radio show one morning. That could be where it was. And they were asking if I supported federal funding for sanctuary cities, to which I said absolutely not. And when life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, life begins with a secure border, and we have to have secure borders. So I do not support federal funding of sanctuary cities. And then having said that, I do believe in states' rights. We don't have sanctuary cities in South Carolina, and we've had local officials and state officials that have made it clear that that's not going to happen, and a governor that says that. And I don't want anybody from California telling us what we can do in our state. And if somebody in California wants to do something and the folks say that, then they can do what they want to in their city, but they do not get federal dollars to do it, is my answer there. Did that do it?
I understand your position, but just to reiterate that final point. So San Francisco declares itself a sanctuary city. You think
Which they have.
And you think they're entitled to do so?
Which they have, and they're also getting federal dollars. So no, that's not okay. But so no, I don't think that we give federal money, and I don't think that we help people to do that. Right now, nobody's cut that off, and I can guarantee you if they cut that off, that they change the position really quick.
So if the cutoff of federal monies was complete, you would still be okay with them declaring a sanctuary city?
In California, they can declare what they want to. They're so different than we are here, and I totally believe in states' rights. Like, I really do. And the dangerous part about that, so no, that's asinine to me, but there's things that people in California or Philadelphia think that we do wrong that's here. So I think that one reason that our country is so great is because of states' rights. So I don't want to tell someone else what to do as long as they're not taking federal funding to do it.
I think that earlier Justin was directing his question at me. The look of frustration on your face indicated to me that you were looking to me for that answer. Were you at that time?
Well, either one, because he said he didn't hog the mic, I guess. But I was just saying either or.
Well, I'd like to ask permission to answer that question as well. I think we have to take dramatic action. You know, I appreciate what you're saying about Social Security, but it's a light approach. We need to eliminate Social Security. We need to take everything that the federal government shouldn't be involved in and move it out of the federal government, reducing non-defense spending by at least 75%. That's all in my book. And furthermore, we need to unleash the free market in this country. And if we unleash the free market, flat tax of 15% max, national sales tax, let the states do more and have the opportunity to differentiate themselves, we will see an unleashing of the free market like we've never seen. We'll see 7% compound annual growth for 10 years. That doubles the economy in 10 years. That does a lot to get us out of the hole. If we reduce the national debt, I mean basically, we can get out of it. What I'm concerned about is worldwide debt has escalated to $233 trillion on assets of about $270 trillion. That's about an 80% leverage ratio, and the globalists want to crash our economy. That's their plan. What are they going to do? Implement special drawing rights, negative interest rates, bail-ins? They're going to come right into the rescue to fix the problem that they created. So in my book, I advocate for a preemptive approach where we declare the year of Jubilee. It's a bold move. And outlaw debt. We have the liberty to self-govern. We can outlaw debt, just like we can outlaw health insurance altogether to fix the health insurance problem. So my question, I'm down to my question. Shannon, a couple times you've mentioned that the Constitution is flawless. James Madison indicated that there will be errors. We've had 27 amendments. The last amendment was proposed with the original 10 that were ratified. In fact, there were 12 proposed. One is still out there hanging around, yet to be ratified after 200 years. So do you not respect the amendments that we've had? Do you not think that we should amend at any time? And if you think we can amend the Constitution, what amendment would you suggest that we do?
Okay, and when I say that I think the Constitution is flawlessly written, I stand by that. I believe that the Bible is the only book that's been perfectly written. And when I say flawless, I mean that a white sheet of paper can be flawless where you see it without flaw. So sometimes there's work that I do, and when I look at it, there's some flaws, and I know I need to fix it before I do it again. And I can look at it until I see that it's flawless, and then I submit it. There's a lot of times that I've seen people work on projects where they know that it's flawed. An example of something that was clearly flawed was the Affordable Care Act. We knew that was flawed. Like, as soon as you read it, you knew that it was flawed. But when I think back to over 200 years ago, people that disagreed, so Madison and Jefferson and Adams, these were people that did not really think alike, but they thought that there was something bigger than themselves. And when I think about folks that lock themselves in a room and put something on paper that still guides us today, and that was the greatest experiment ever, I think that's great. And then because of the way that the Constitution's written, and because of the way that we do have the checks and balances, and folks can have amendments for certain times and places. So like Air Force isn't mentioned in the Constitution, right? Because there's not airplanes. So there's things that are going to change, but I think that the words that they used were very wise. And probably the only amendments that I think weren't great were the 18th and the 21st. Just when you put in no alcohol, you had to come back through and undo it, and there was less personal freedom.
So you don't agree with any of the amendments?
Other
Other than
read
those
all
two,
of them,
which cancel each other out.
Yeah. No, each amendment. So the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, all of them, yes. But I don't think that that means that the Constitution was flawed. I think it shows that the Constitution was written well and our government was structured well so that amendments can be introduced and voted on into law.
So there's no amendment that you would propose today? What about repealing the 17th Amendment?
No. I don't think that there's anything that I would oppose today if it's there. There are a couple on taxes, and where taxes are in there, that when I look at it, it looks highly skeptical, but there's nothing that I would appeal that's there now. No. Repeal.
All right, now we're going to have closing remarks from the candidates. Each candidate gets 3 minutes. And we'll start with Shannon.
Thank you all for being here today. Background, just for the folks that maybe don't know me, because I don't think I introduced myself when I was here. Born here in Greenville, raised my children here, married my husband here, started a business here, took care of patients here, and plan to die here. I know that I was fortunate and hit the jackpot to be born in the greatest country on earth. I believe that the Southeast is the greatest region to be in, and I believe South Carolina is the greatest state. And I also think this 4th Congressional District is a really good district. So I'm honored that you guys are here and that you're listening to us, and I'd be honored if you consider voting for me to represent you for the next 2 years and then maybe beyond. What I do know is there's a lot that I don't know, and I learned that as business, but where I've been effective is when I set a goal and there's something that I want to do, I've been able to do it on time and under budget each time. They didn't teach me that in nursing school, but they taught me really good skills in nursing school, and as a critical care nurse, you learn to assess a situation really quickly, to diagnose it, then you plan and you plan with others, and you have to be acting, you have to be intervening, but before you start to act, you know how you're going to evaluate it before you start. And if you're doing something and you need to pivot, that you need to be able to do that. And that's where I think that we need common sense in DC now more than ever. We have a president who is shaking stuff up. Regardless of people's politics, I think they all believe that there's something that's happening. And we need representatives there, and we need people in DC that are willing to shake things up too. So I'm not saying I'm the only candidate that would shake it up, but I can tell you that I have a track record of shaking things up, and I'm not afraid to stand alone. I'm not afraid not to get reelected, but it's with fear and trembling that I'm willing to vote on behalf of 750,000 people, and it's something that I'd take very seriously. So thank you for your time.
I want to thank you all as well. Thank you, Justin and Owen, for putting this on. The reason I'm here running for Congress is because I want to make a difference. I think that the Constitution is a great backbone of what we're doing, and it is a system that helps us move forward better, more prosperously. And understanding that system and understanding human nature and understanding the differences in individuals, that's why I want to augment that system. I want to bring back, or bring to Congress, the delegate model of representation. I think that we need to have personal responsibility in running this country, that every one of us needs to have our say in it, that we don't just elect representatives to go and then say, oh, let's put term limits in place so that if they're not doing the right thing according to our will, then they're out. I think that we need to ensure that we need to be involved in politics every day. Republicans are supposed to stand for limited government, limited federal government. The only way to have limited federal government is to have increase the power of local and state government. To increase the power of local and state government, you have to be involved every day almost. At least having a conversation around the dinner table, talking about the issues, what's coming up, what's on the calendar for this week, what's on the calendar for next week, what do you care about most? You need to lobby your neighbors, talk, politic, get to know one another. So that's what I want to do. I want to get you all and myself involved in the future of our country, in the future of our society, in the future of our children. Have opportunity to access opportunity, you have to have the knowledge, and you can't get the knowledge by sitting around by yourself, sitting behind the TV, sitting on the couch, sitting behind the phone, and just saying to yourself, "Oh, I'll do it tomorrow." We have to be involved continuously. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get involved myself. I'm not a career politician. I'm just an ordinary guy. I work 40 hours a week. I get up at 6 a.m. and go to work and come out at 2. Work with my hands. I'm going to school as well to become a teacher of history in the public school system, because I know that as an individual I have a responsibility to share my knowledge. It's an understanding that Aristotle passed out hundreds of years ago, that's the only thing that true freedom brings is the knowledge of it. You have to give that to each other. Raising a kid, caring for life, caring for being pro-life, you have to care about their future as well, not just their conception. That's the reason these choices are hard for people, is because life is not easy. Every decision is different, but the responsibility of those decisions are extreme, and we have to understand that, and we have to work together. I need help. We all need support, and we were looking for you. We're doing this for your support, but for me, I want to talk to you. I want to learn from you. I want you to be more involved, because it's easier for me to be involved if you're involved. I can go out and be happy talking to you about politics if you're willing to talk about politics. But as you see, this room is not filled. We need to fill this room. We need to fill all the rooms when it comes to issues like this, when it comes to the future, every 2 years. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for being here, and thank you for the hosts for setting up this event and allowing at least 5 of the candidates to appear here tonight. I'm running for Congress because I'm concerned about the direction of the country. I've talked a little bit about my principles: American security, American business workers, and American way of life. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe in something called American nationalism. And I've used that phrase a few times on this campaign, and some people have criticized me for it because they feel like it's kind of an arrogant way of presenting the United States. But I've lived around the world. I've seen other countries. I've seen good and bad in other countries. And I've experienced many things there that have confirmed for me that we are an exceptional country. And we need to preserve that. And it starts with American security, then our people and our way of life. 2 anniversaries yesterday I think are worth recalling if you're not aware of them already, because they say a lot about the essence of America, in my opinion. One is Clara Barton announced and created the American Red Cross. That's an anniversary yesterday. She went to the Civil War battlefields to try to get on the battlefield to aid the injured and sick, and she was chased away by the American generals because they said the battlefield is no place for a woman. But she was persistent, and eventually she got into the field. And she took care of many wounded soldiers and became known as the angel of the battlefield. I mentioned her, and I bring up that anniversary because that spirit of voluntarism, of helping someone else, is essential in America. We're very charitable people. We help internationally. We help among our own communities, more so both in nature and in statistics than any other country. It's also an anniversary, yesterday was, of Charles Lindbergh landing the Spirit of St. Louis in Paris. First transatlantic flight, a solitary, strong-willed, ingenious man got the airplane ready, flew across the Atlantic. That's a pragmatic and principled and effective way of doing things that is essential to this country and part of what's made America the country it is. So as been mentioned by my other candidates, we thank you for being here. We hope that you'll go out and vote on June 12th. It's a crowded field. Everyone has something to offer. I'd like you to take a look at my record, my positions, and perhaps I can convince you to give me your vote. Have a good night.
As the others, I'd like to thank the moderators for inviting us and for the other candidates. Thank you for participating in this. And as I mentioned to one of the moderators, my hope was that those of us that come to this are happy we did, and those that didn't make it are sad that they missed it. So all of those that weren't able to attend for various conflicts, maybe there'll be another opportunity to debate the other candidates. Our nation is in distress, and that's the theme of my book. The flag is upside down on the cover of my book. Our nation is in distress, and we the people have to do something. We have to have an action plan to get behind. And in my book, I call out a clear and present danger. There are 6 major threats. There are a lot of things that we need to address. There are 6 that I called out in that chapter. The refugees, the refugee problem, the invasion of our southern border, and the United Nations, that refugee program, and basically terrorists are infiltrating our country. We need to militarize our border to fix that problem, and we need to build a wall. And like Nehemiah rebuilt Jerusalem, sword in one hand and trowel in the other. We need to secure our border with the military. The president has a commander; he's commander in chief, and he can authorize posting up at the border to stop the invasion. Second, we've got a global financial crisis that's brewing, and I've addressed that previously. We've got, our country, we can get our house in order if we dramatically cut non-defense spending, et cetera, and we can leave the world. And I'm concerned about what's going on with that global financial collapse that they're engineering. We have lawless liberals doing things like sanctuary cities and letting people in Charlottesville, letting the protests get out of hand is what happened in Charlottesville. That's the major thing that happened during that time. Baltimore riots, Ferguson, Berkeley. Lawless liberals they're people that have a design to destroy our nation. Globalists, liberals, radical environmentalists. They're forces at work that we have to fight against. Otherwise, we're going to lose our republic. One of the biggest problems we have is we don't have integrity in our elections. And we're seeing everything from election fraud at the local level to what's going on with what the deep state did and what they're doing to try to undermine the president of the United States. With all that has what's being exposed now, and we have to believe it's just the tip of the iceberg. So we can secure our elections by going to paper ballots. It's a very simple solution. The solutions are simple, they're just not easy. So we the people have to get together and organize around a plan. That's why I published the book. It's a plan. It's not strictly a book that just sits there on the shelf. We can modify it as we go and get behind it and reach a consensus. And the silent majority needs to become the clamoring majority. So that's what we need to do to fix the problems we have in our country. And I appreciate your consideration.
105%. Hang on to that number for a minute. My name is John Marshall Mosser. As I said earlier, I have extensive financial experience in accounting and banking. I'm a business lawyer. I have an international MBA. I'm also the father of a 2-year-old daughter. And my wife and I have been married for 9 years. She is a first-generation American citizen. She came to the country legally. She did it the right way. I'm very, very passionate about the rule of law, and I'm very, very passionate that we restore our country to fiscal soundness. So what's the 105%? That is the size that our national debt is going to be relative to our GDP in 10 years if nothing else is done. So we talk a lot about financial mismanagement in Washington, and that just is like trees and grass grow. Washington mismanages money. But we need to understand the scope of the crisis that's about to hit us. The last time our debt was 105% of our GDP was 1946, the year after World War II ended. We had a pretty good reason for it, and in 1947, the debt was paid down. Not entirely, but we started turning in the right direction. The projections for the 11th year from now are not so rosy. We are entering into a systematic crisis whereby our demographics are going to shift, the baby boomers are going to retire, and we simply don't have enough workers to fund the system as it exists today. We need to make immediate reforms, and what does that need to look like? Talking about the problem is no good unless we have a solution. We need to restructure Social Security in such a way that it maintains its safety net status, that it keeps people out of poverty. But we also need to then empower people to make their own savings decisions. The entire point of the system is that we need to mandate savings. And if people don't save, then people who do save shouldn't be obligated to pay them out. So we have a mandatory saving system. If we take that and we add on top of it private investment, so your retirement is determined by how much you save. So the government keeps you out of poverty, it keeps other people from having to pay for your poverty, and it allows you to invest in your own retirement. That's a path to solvency. We need to institute those reforms immediately. We need to balance our budget, and we need to focus on our financial issues. So if you believe, like I do, that fiscal and financial issues are the most pressing problem facing our country, I would say that we're spoiled for choice in candidates here. My relatives that live outside of the state of South Carolina watch some of this, and they're astounded that there are 13 people or now 12 people that believe as we do. And I say that's South Carolina. We're spoiled for choice. But I would submit to you that my resume, my background in financial services, in accounting, and law stacks up very favorably to the rest of the field. And I respect a lot of the things that everyone has said. But I request your vote, and if you'd like to learn more about me, go to votemosser.com. Thank you.
All right. I'd like to thank everybody who attended tonight. I look out and I see so many old friends and patriots here. And let's give all the candidates a hand. Thank you so much for coming. you know, engaging in the process is really the lifeblood of the Republic. I'd like to also thank the library for hosting the event, and a special thanks to John Schaefer and Jeff Davis, who did the audio and video, and to our timekeeper, Olga Lashinska, and to guest moderator Eric Wood, and also a special thanks to my lovely wife, Anna.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Justin and Owen for allowing me to be part of this. As a host of Another Voice with Eric and friends, this is exactly what we try to promote. You know, my show is about getting people to make a difference. And 13 or 12 candidates on the Republican side, 5 on the Democrat, 1 American Party. We've got people involved. Now the voters need to get involved. And you all here are active, obviously. Those watching are active. But we need to get more people involved. The largest turnout for a primary since 2000 was 23% of the voting population. So one thing I hope you take away from this is to make sure you get your friends and your neighbors and your relatives and your coworkers to get out and vote, because we definitely have choice. Thank you.